So Cave Crawlers has become one of my favorite games I've discovered in the past year, so much so that I ended up doing what I historically never do for any game, which is actually involve myself in a community. Then I built the wiki, then I made this channel, and then I spend a little too much time on all those things, so clearly the game has something good under its initially simple presentation. Which is true. Cave Crawlers has over 200 items present in the default branch of the game now, so it's no surprise that it's led to a wide variation of loadout approaches, all with unique beauties in each class. But underneath those pretty loadouts lies a small problem with the division of loot and general item balancing when considering where an item is found relative to another. So let's talk about how that is. Let's talk about the Cave Crawler's item balance. So here's a bit of context. Back in the olden days of Cave Crawlers, each piece of armor gave some form of flat stat buff simply by wearing it, occasionally also providing a special item effect. This was balanced out by having slots specifically tailored to the helmets and boots category, forcing the player to have a maximum of 3 trinkets instead of the later added 5. On the great day of May 23, 2025, however, this was entirely reworked with the 0.81 update. No longer did each armor piece provide a flat stat buff, but rather was divided into several armor categories that could be worn interchangeably, granted that they didn't go over the capacity that was tied to the item in the slot. Being changed after over 2 years in the game's development was a massive decision. Splintering the entire item balance into various directions, this question arose as to what the limits were now. After all, would you choose to go purely offensive? Would you choose to go heavily into tank? Would you combine specific armor pieces in order to increase the viability of an older weapon and make it more powerful than a new one? This change added incredible variation to the game, and considering how much it changed, resulted in very few problems across the board. But we wouldn't be here if there were no problems, so let's take a look at some of those extremes that were pre-existing or introduced from the 0.81 changes. First up, backpacks. They're nice, they appear on proper floors, offer a trade-off of directly offensive and defensive buffs in favor of potions and item storage, and this is the only category I have no complaints with, so much so that I really can't think of any backpacks that could be added to the game that would be necessary. So moving on. Belts. Belts are an armor type that has the max capacity of 1 and is designed to be an offensive piece of armor. There are only 2 belts in the game, yet every class can seemingly benefit from a single one of these options, which is part of my problem. For context, the black belt offers a flat stat buff at 10% movement speed and 50% dodge chance, while providing 50% critical strike chance buff for 8 seconds on dodge with a 60-second cooldown. Overall, it's a really solid item. It provides the dodge chance to utilize its effect while adding a low base movement speed buff that allows it to be worn in place of boots if given that you don't want to utilize foot day or leather worker with the armor expertise, or want lower movement speed to use heavily armored for the hammer expertise tree, even though for both those examples, this item is not something commonly used for their respective class, both of which are troubling. Attack speed is a stat that can be found in very few places. The Adventurer's Belt, the Mithril Bracers, the Miner's Pendant, the Silver Ring, the Humming Crystal, generally with notable balance trade-offs to using each one. But the Adventurer's Belt is special. It has many problems that come with it. First off, there isn't a single class in the game that can't benefit immensely from using this belt. A 10% buff for any class as a base stat is simply huge, and the trade-off for using it is only 1 armor slot. With 10%, Axe gets a much better chance to stack procs from its expertise, which is very important for Axe. Sword gets even faster, which negates the slower trade-off for going for degen instead of Brittle Blade in Sword Path, while Rapiers just gets even faster as an already dagger level attack speed class. Dagger gets incredibly easier dagger swiper chaining and ramp up, which is already its make or break expertise talent for the class, which even if you don't go the top path just means it's way faster crits for poison blade applications. Polearm gets one of extremely few attack speed buffs it can get as a base stat, allowing it to stun and bleed chain faster, but more importantly cuts down the time it takes for favored winds, the best talent for range, to proc given the minuscule chance it didn't proc for infinite chaining during the rapid fire spell, removing the 1 period of downtime you'd actually have for DPS. Torch gets a much faster application of DOTs for both single target and multi-target. Hammer gets 167% larger attack speed base than its own expertise can even offer. It's simply too much for too little taken away. The Adventurer's Belt is easily the best go-to trinket for any class for thoughtless buffs, given you aren't heavily prioritizing defense or critical strike damage like Hammer typically does. But once again, this is a common rarity trinket found as early as the end of the first biome and applies unmatched utility to every class. It is extremely foolish to pass up such an option unless you are specifically building elsewhere, once again notably for slow chain builds, as if they really exist. So here's what I'm going to say. Obviously the buffs have to be lowered and put into consideration of other armor options, as well as some minor changes to the initial appearance. As such, I believe the changes should be this. The Adventurer's Belt will have its base stats reduced to 8% and 8% respectively. The rarity is increased from common to rare, and the origin floor is increased from floor 10 to floor 11. At 5%, you might as well run Mithril Bracers. At 10%, you might as well run nothing else, but between the two is the only sweet spot we can take. A 2% decrease puts it above other attack speed options, while also giving it the option to trade out for other flat buffs simultaneously or by loadout, which is how I believe armor should be functioning in the first place. Originally, I wanted to reduce the total buffs to 7% each instead, but in consideration of the mithril bracers trading 8% block chance for 2% attack speed felt a little too low. The rarity is something I think should have been present to begin with, and I rank it higher than any other option purely due to its single slot base stat buffs that it can provide. As for the floor change, it is extremely minor, but even in the smallest chance of it occurring, I don't believe the players should be able to find an item of this quality right before they fight the Crimson Slosh. As a small note, I believe it should be universal. Personally, although I doubt that this is an agreed upon thing, finding an item from the next biome by sheer luck on the final floor is just odd, and the items themselves don't make too much sense, being out of place from their original biome, at least in my opinion. Additionally, I'd love to see either the stats from this belt go to a new one, or a new belt being introduced to fill the role of the original Adventurer's belt, which had low universal stats across the board as a small boost to a larger series of stats. Considering the strictly offensive nature belts are supposed to have, ignore the black belt having movement speed and dodge chance, I could see lower stats sprinkled into a bunch of slots for one belt. This change was put into effect in 0.81, losing its 4% block chance, movement speed, and dodge chance it previously had, but even before then it was more universal back in stats in 0.726. If not a belt to give this stat, then something else? I miss the silly a bit of everything buff that it used to give. Anyway, this has been my favorite belt and armor for a long time, but I have to let it fall back into balance. Going over to a much shorter segment, boots. Boots are an armor type that has a max capacity of 1 and is designated to be a mobility focused piece of armor, which it does beautifully. But one piece of this boots category falls extremely short, the blast-proof boots. The blast-proof boots provide 10% movement speed and the promise to immunity of explosive damage. The promise. I'm almost inclined to say that the blast immunity of these boots not working is a secret at this point, purely because I never see anyone use these boots, let alone take explosive damage with them due to the widely underused nature of explosives, which we'll talk about at the end of the video. My interpretations for this armor's goal is to trade off the 10% dexterity you gain from using the leather boots with the immunity to blast damage, but the rarity change, the blast immunity for that just isn't worth it at all, even if the armor wasn't filled with empty promises. I have two proposals for the changes on these things. The first change would be to give them some sort of dexterity stat and minor movement speed boost to justify the trade-off in rarity. A 12% movement speed and 8% dexterity is one set of changes, allowing it to be a slightly more movement speed focused alternative to the leather boots with the immunity to assist it. As someone who believes dexterity is an underrated and underutilized stat, frankly, I would still be inclined to use the leather boots over this change, but I could see many swapping to blastproof, so I don't think this is over the top. The other alternative I see is the reverse of this, making the blast-proof boots only give 8% movement speed, but providing 12% dexterity, which would play more into the being more versed into meticulous activities thing I'd expect from someone dealing with explosives. This would make it the lowest movement speed boots option, but would be the best direct dexterity buff, yet not outclassed by the speedy boots 35% buff on its movement speed threshold. Frankly, I enjoy the latter change better for armor distinction, which I think works a lot better for the game itself. As for bracers, which are supposed to be defensive base stat armor pieces with a cap of 2, I don't see a need to directly change any of these. They function incredibly well for diversity and interchangeability. The only thing I want to add here is a note about their rarities, which I think are a bit weird and inconsistent. The Dirty Steel bracers are the only non-common rarity, being rare, likely due to their nature of being, by defensive chance, a direct upgrade to the leather bracers found on 4 floors prior, but all of the bracers remain common despite great utility. I preface this by saying I don't have any bracers I would immediately change. I don't think I'm in a proper position to decide what is all one rarity, but I will note that I find it weird that the Dirty Steel is the only one that is rare, despite its continued viability and origin on floor 5. If there are more bracers, I could see this being changed, but frankly I'm not sure what else I would add for bracers that wouldn't stray away from the defensive nature. I will once again advocate for the new movement speed plus dexterity plus dodge chance bracers though. Mysterious and Evil Cloaks. Cloaks are a defensive proc-based armor type that have a max capacity of 1, and I love them ever so much. The main change I want to note lies within the Ranger's Cloak. Frankly, I believe aside from the dodge chance this cloak presents, which is outmatched by other cloaks, this thing is useless. If you are playing ranged properly, also known as getting the favored wins expertise talent, you practically have a constant 130% reload speed buff as is, even though that's capped. As a result, even in your low points, you generally don't have a use for its active effect, which is gaining 20% reload speed for 10 seconds on a dodge, which is uncapped by the way, while the black belt of a similar, albeit stronger effect is, unintentional or not. Reload speed is incredibly easy to come by through the expertise tree, and it simply isn't worth the trade-off. Instead of a reload speed buff, I believe a ranged critical strike chance or damage buff is more suited, just like the black belts. The expertise tree for ranged already gives you 30% critical strike damage, so it isn't taken over the top to not need more. But the black belt also gives a critical strike chance buff, so I could see some potential quote-unquote abuse for a giant crit chance on dodge, but one would be guaranteed and the other a 50% proc, so maybe it wouldn't be too bad? Maybe it's just a strong synergy to go for if you're willing to risk dodging. Between the two, I believe a critical strike damage buff would be less overpowered, maybe an additional 20% to complement the pre-existing 30% that the expertise gives you, would make it uncapped for those more daring. If it were kept to be a critical strike chance buff, I would probably say that it's best to keep it capped and at a lower rate, as crit chaining with range is already very easy. A small thing to add here is a tweak to the Worm Scale Cloak, which I believe, when combined with decent dodge chance or high base block chance, results in a pinch of immortality? Yeah. So as it turns out when writing this script, I came to test and realize the true potential of this thing, which is just the power to never die. This is especially noticeable when using the Kill Me Later perk, as storing damage counts as being struck, which can cause additional procs to the already unbelievable chaining. As you've been watching in the footage you see now, I just can't die. I took 44 hits before dying while wearing this thing and a couple other items with similar floor range, even when I was intentionally trying to die and without major KML storage occurring. When combined with the other similar items like the Obsidian Band, you can become literally invincible, and I have tested such to be true, getting hit over 16,000 times without ever going below 4 health. This thing has to have some changes to it. Sadly though, I believe this does mean making it weaker for lower block chances, but based on its floor origin, I don't think that matters much. First off, the decrease in movement speed by 10% for this thing really doesn't matter much, but it's also hard to increase that value without making you completely immobile, so I'm not sure if it could be changed at all. I think instead the threshold should be changed here, as well as the total buff given. The 10% block chance on proc should be reduced to 8% at a minimum, while the proc condition should change to only proc when between the range of 40 to 80% block chance, reducing its ability to infinitely chain, and slightly punishing you for more lower block chance, although as stated before, that punishment is barely noticeable due to the amount of block chance given by most helmets combined with the cloak itself. I could see this thing getting nerfed further, but honestly you can only punish an item for its extremes so much without destroying the base item, so I will leave it to the lords from here to fix if needed. Helmets are generally very well balanced out though. They have a good step up when it comes to rarity and defense, with solid variation through all the biomes. But there's always a few issues, starting with the Adventurer's Hat. This whole set is kinda troublesome, huh? The helmet itself is alright, with the potential to have the highest dodge chance from any helmet at 35% from its default 10% base. There is one tiny particular issue with this proc that I want to note, as it relies solely on you as the wearer to open the chest to proc its effect, forcing you to be a chest hoarder to be efficiently defensive, which you'll certainly need for the inevitable foul insults thrown your way for stealing yet another chest from the corrupted dwarf on your team. If the effect itself could be proc from any player, it wouldn't have issues in multiplayer, which alone I think should be part of the set, even though that it's the adventurer himself doing the exploring. The helmet itself is still kind of weak all things considered, but I think it's a really cool take on the temporary buff chaining, so I think it can be left as is everywhere else, unless a small stat buff was added, like the belt counterpart. The Eye of Beholder is a weird helmet as well, because the 100% critical strike damage on one item is a pretty big deal, but even then I rarely see it ever used, even by critical strike damage enthusiasts. But it does fill a small, special place for low critical strike chance builds, so it could be fine. I do think that it needs a small defensive boost though, unless more items that focus on lower critical strike chance loadouts are added, which I will talk about a bit later, so hold that thought. If more items like that are added, leave it as is. Otherwise, I think it needs a minor defensive incentive to stay more interesting. Necklaces. They kinda suck. This is a well-known issue amongst the lords, something which I have talked to them about a few times, but I do want to talk about a few things anyway. The idea that base stats will be added to necklaces has been thrown around by them, which I simply don't know well enough to throw in a random stat as is, more or less. I do want to note some of the issues within the item procs themselves though, which are what necklaces are based around, at a cap of 1 per dwarf. While I don't know if any stats could or should be directly appended, I think it would be a good move to make for some or all in a minor form. So that part about necklaces being proc only, so what if a necklace itself doesn't have literally any proc? Meet the Crystal Necklace, arguably the least impactful armor in the game, which solely increases your spell haste by 100%, making all spell cast times instant. Yeah, that's it. The least important stat in the game is the only buff for this armor piece. Yay! So first off, I'm not entirely sure why they removed the revive speed buff since this trinket wasn't that amazing back then, and I think it could return in some form if the stats were going to be appended, but not necessarily as a high buff, but I'll talk about that here in a minute. While I'm not sure what would be a good direct proc for this, I would find it interesting if the proc is tailored around the support nature and gives buffs to Torch and Hammer, providing the extra buff as a bonus for dealing fire damage caused by the smite expertise. Whether that buff be damage, movement speed, spreading the effect, I don't know, but it's something to think about. The Holy Necklace is another one in a weird spot, because even in large groups I never see it used, even though it was literally more than doubled in efficiency recently. It's good for keeping people alive immediately after the revival, obviously, but outside of the Vlachno fight, where going right back into lava is a possibility, it really isn't applicable in a lot of other fights. It's simply too niche. Rather than changing the proc entirely though, I would suggest that this necklace houses revive speed as opposed to the crystal necklace, as well as a tiny extra stat with the proc, maybe a movement speed buff for the person who's revived, or all players due to how long the cooldown is for this thing, kind of like a reverse flash blitz expertise for Torch, giving it more utility in its niche. Over to the Miner's Pendant. I just want to note a minor thing here. Any effect that can broadcast to all dwarfs is a big deal, but with the Miner's Pendant, it doesn't live up to that standard. Universal attack speed is a pretty big deal as is, especially after how much I talked about it with the Adventurer's Belt, but here it just doesn't feel that useful. It's stackable across all dwarves, which is interesting, but for an epic rarity it barely will show up often enough to make use of such a feature, especially considering the horrendous lack of event rooms in the Molten Collapse. It doesn't feel impactful as an epic. Running Mithril Bracers with the Adventurer's Belt is simply the better option, even in multiplayer, due to the lack of utility, at least from my experience. I think it chains together just fine, with the lower cooldown giving you time to refresh the buff before it ends, so the cooldown, time, and chance aren't the issue. The whole necklace just lacks a good oomph. I should go ahead and stop and take a moment to say that not every item in the game has to be great, and similarly, armor is the main example of this, with armor pieces slowly outclassing each other. But epics have a standard. Lord Spartan, co-founder, developer, and head artist for Heroic Pixel, the company that made cave crawlers, states that epic rarities should be truly, quote, epic, and have unique and powerful effects, which this simply doesn't have that power. As is, I don't believe it fully deserves to be an epic, so some type of change is in favor if it's going to stay an epic, but if the effect stays, the rarity should reflect that and be lowered. The Noble's Necklace is a dexterity-focused necklace that is in a bit of a weird place as well. Few items provide dexterity, so this is a decent source of it, especially because it applies it to all players, but the chance on hit/duration gives it a bit more of an issue. If you're a class that desperately needs the dexterity, like Hammer or Polearm, you don't attack enough to make this worth using at all, and if you are a class that greatly utilizes it, like Dagger, then be prepared because everyone in the game is about to have max dexterity in literally under a few seconds. This effect has no cooldown or max capacity like the Miner's Pendant does, making faster attacking classes be able to provide massive buffs to literally everyone. It is conflicting, as is Miner's, because the stat of dexterity is not typically thought to be important, but one necklace maxing out a stat for every dwarf is huge, yet at the same time, literally no one uses this thing. It's so good at doing a thing that no one seems to care about, yet it isn't ever used. So is there a reason to change this? It could be more universal with a higher chance of proc at a capacity or a much larger buff with the cooldowns, but would it even be used then? Remember when I said that items don't have to be great to exist? This applies here as well, as without items like this covering more niche and important stats, the game loses some of its variation. It could be amazing, yet isn't used, yet also isn't great at the same time. It's a curious case, so maybe it doesn't need any change after all. Onto the Skull Pendant, the dethroned king of crit loadouts. An on-kill effect for a buff of 50% critical strike damage until your next critical strike, which is likely just going to be eaten up to the very next mob with little difference. It isn't too big of a deal, all things considered, especially when you remember that the Cobalt Bracers offer a flat 40% critical strike damage at all times, and are much more consistent comparatively. I think taking the necklace in a different direction of critical strike damage would be interesting, so here's what I propose. Killing a mob increases your critical strike damage by 50% until your next critical strike. Killing a mob additionally reduces your critical strike chance by 10% for 5 seconds. With the change of reducing your critical strike chance, it enables the possibility to have the lower crit chance by default to largely stack up your critical strike damage bonus, which if you don't continue to kill mobs, the crit chance removal will go away, making you risk losing it. Additionally, it gives minor incentive for target priority, making you finish weaker enemies first to maintain the reduction, and then taking all that built up critical strike damage to potentially do massive damage to the remaining enemy. As I hinted at earlier, it would synergize really well with the Eye of the Beholder, since few people ever use that in the first place. Rings are really funny and super unbalanced. If we were being honest here, most rings desperately need to be nerfed. It's a sad reality, but man are they so overpowered, often being an unquestionable must-have for any loadout for any class. For those unaware, the gold and silver rings are the kings of all armor pieces, providing the most insane, infinitely stacking buffs of the two most important stats of the game. First off, I want to state that Lord Spartan stated that he is generally against max cap for armor pieces, so with that being said, my changes will be about the proc changes instead. So let's rapid fire here. The gold ring should have a lower duration to complement its non-on-kill effect, debatably with a slightly lower proc chance. As such, I recommend an 8-second duration for the current 10 seconds, and possibly a 40% proc chance for the current 50% chance. This reduces the insane, never-ending crit chaining that it can provide while keeping its power, while making it slightly harder to ramp up the critical strike chance values initially. The shadowy band has a bit of potential to become an immortality machine as mentioned before, but frankly, I don't think it needs a massive change considering its low usage, but debatably a small decrease from its duration from 8 seconds to 6 seconds. The silver ring though? The turn my class into a dagger ring. The really easy solution is to simply reduce the duration down from 15 seconds significantly. If it stays at a 50% chance due to its effect being an on-kill reliant effect, that duration needs to drop down to 10 seconds at a minimum, but I think a more fitting change would be an 8-second duration accompanied by a reduction of the 4% attack speed from 5%. These changes will reduce the overpowered nature of these rings while keeping them in a fair proc spotlight. Now let's go over to a little bit more detailed ring talk. The Lucky Band sucks fat donkey balls. According to Lord Spartan, it was designed to be a direct upgrade to the gold ring, yet it functions worse than it in every aspect. At a 5% chance on hit for a 5% critical strike chance buff, the buff it gives is so small at such a small chance that the classes that generally need the crit chance from this, such as Rapier, Polearm, or Ranged, have no reason to utilize this over the gold ring. Rapier is the one class that could theoretically use this due to its negative critical strike chance, but even with its higher attack speed, there is very little incentive to use it comparatively to other armor pieces like Rigged Dice, Broken Bottle, or other rings. It's just an item that fills a niche of negative crit chance for positive over time, but that just isn't applicable everywhere like critical strike damage can be. If you want to keep filling this niche though, it definitely can't be titled the more powerful version of the gold ring, and should be put on an earlier floor for Rapier to utilize before they get better options. If it really is supposed to be a better form of the gold ring, then just... no? The gold ring, as we just talked about, is already one of the best armor pieces of the entire game. You absolutely do not need a better version of it. But do as you will. If that means the entire rebalance to both, then so be it. The spider circlet is probably one of my favorite items by visual design. After all, just look at the little guy. He reminds me of the little man from Andrew, but all things considered, it isn't a great ring. Wait a second. This isn't even a ring. Honestly, until I was clarifying my script, I didn't even make the connection that circlets are head ornaments, meaning this spider just chills on your forehead. I just automatically assumed that the trinket that is a reskinned ring would be a ring, somewhat logically. Is that intentional? Wait, wouldn't that make this a helmet then? After all, the Eye of the Beholder is a helmet, and it's just eyewear. Is that how he fixed the Eye of the Beholder? Just make it a normal trinket? Or is it the spider circlet that's secretly a helmet? Huh. Okay, sorry anyways. The issue isn't within the proc itself though, as frankly a 10% chance for a reset of Heavy Strike and Rip is pretty solid, if not a little low, but the issue is that the game currently fails to support a more spell-oriented playstyle. You can reset those spells, but you'll ultimately lose out on total DPS and general viability. For Rip, you are practically always better off just attacking enemies after the initial Rip usage, which is a huge shame because I desperately want to see more spell-focused gameplay. As for Heavy Strike, the spell itself is so wildly slow that even with instant refresh, you're only wasting buffs that you gain from casting the spell itself, even with maxed expertise. If there is a better way to reduce the animation for spells, like having spell casting tied to your attack speed, this would be incredibly more viable, which is something I could see coming to the game without big balance issues. This is a genuine suggestion, by the way. The slower classes already have slower animations, so it would even out initially and provide more variation of attack speed, aside from desperately trying to become a cave crawler's wood chipper recreation. That, or you could just make spell haste increase the animation itself too, which would give that stat way more viability. I don't really have any direct changes to state here aside from saying that the ring is out of place and incomplete compared to the rest of the game balance, which is a huge shame because I really do love the idea of this item, even if it doesn't work well in practice. On to actual trinkets, how nice. The Ball of Crimson Slime. It really isn't great, especially if you're an epic rarity, but if the rework that I've heard echoes of is going to exist in a rebalance someday, then I have no more comment on it. That's all I'm going to say. The Broken Bottle is an extreme because it has insane damage output for most classes, particularly higher speed classes, yet at the same time, it really is the glass cannon of all items by reducing your block and dodge chance of 30% for 10 seconds, with no max capacity. The issue I want to note here is that it really doesn't matter if it's 30% or 3000%, because if you were using this trinket, you might as well not be playing with any block or dodge at all, primarily due to the duration. It destroys any ability to defend yourself with weird numbers that, even on slower attack speed builds, just reduces you to being made of paper. If it is intended to be a true glass cannon item, then why is it specific on the numbers? If this isn't supposed to destroy your defense, then reduce the duration and total reduction of this considerably, possibly giving it more viability for slow classes, with a reduction of the total power it gives to offset this buff if necessary. I want to state for the record that I like this item a lot. The strong risk of having no defense for an immense power is really cool, albeit out of place for a rare item. After all, look at how the rigged dice function so similar to this thing. So it doesn't need a quote-unquote nerf, it just strikes me as a bit odd in what it's trying to do. Before I move on, I also want to note that this thing has a very high chance to spawn in the ambush supply route event room, which is pretty common for the first two biomes, so it's not hard to come by despite its large power. Now, down to underpowered items. The Bronze Pocket Watch is literally just the Rebound Square perk, as well as being very close to the Crystallized Ring as is, and I believe that perk effect should never be attainable outside of equipping the perk itself. This is the rebalanced effect that I think was generally slapped on as something, as I worked with Lord Spartan on the 0.81 patch notes back in the day, and the only armor piece he didn't have a proper detailed change for at the time was the Bronze Pocket Watch, which was left blank. Now, previously, on its introduction, it was the only trinket that can compound a flat stat buff as time went on, providing the chance of a permanent movement speed buff upon a floor descent, which fits its timely design as a pocket watch. To be fair, changing this item was entirely valid, as the thing itself was barely functional and worthless considering its floor origin in the Molten Collapse, which gave it no time to compound a proper buff. But I believe, at minimum, this effect should be reverted with one small additional change, being that the floor it is found on is at least a biome earlier, moving from floor 21 to floor 11 instead. By doing this, it would offset one of the main reasons it got nerfed, being that it never got a worthwhile buff by the time the final fight with Valachno came along. Now that's one idea, but I have a more fun suggestion I would like to see, so here's my proposal. The Bronze Pocket Watch is instead moved to be a floor 1 trinket, with a new Pocket Watch being added every biome with stronger ramping buffs to assist the lack of floors to use it on, being a different stat that is capped with every watch. A Bronze Pocket Watch housing its original movement speed it used to have, a Dirty Steel Pocket Watch housing a block chance buff like its other set counterparts, and finally a Noble's Pocket Watch housing a valuable offensive buff such as an extra damage or damage multiplier. All of these could potentially have a stack varying on their power for less abuse from extraction farming, but new trinkets, new buffs, new sets, it's cool stuff. Anyway, at least the reversion of the Bronze Pocket Watch. Let's quickly talk about the Crystal Stinger and the Barbed Chain. I've whined enough about this in the Discord server as is, so I'm not going to give a full depth whine session, but the short solution is to swap the two items' effects as well as their rarities and revert the drop chance nerf on the Crystal Stinger. This gives the clearly more powerful option between the two to be limited to the Goblin Gladiator as a mini-boss, and the lesser version is back to the Crystal Scorpion. Important to note, don't forget to change the damage types from poison to bleed when these are swapped. The Honeycomb Chunk. It's a cool trinket and the only one to have an equip bonus of anything in the game, but the only change I want to make to this thing is to limit the floor radius down to 13 from floor 100 in order to coincide with the Honeycomb Cleaver, as I don't think you should be finding a set bonus item in a place you can't actually find the full set it's part of. The Obsidian Pommel. One of the few armor pieces that actually makes you worse when using it. I can't say it's much of a secret, but the Obsidian Pommel has a huge problem surrounding it, which is the fact that it causes more severe detriments to the user if anything. For the low price of 20% of your attack speed, you too can hit the enemy 30% of the time for a whole 150% weapon damage. All you do is cut off your own hand and render yourself practically useless for 3 seconds, then you can receive the great small damage bonus. I've done pretty extensive testing with this thing, and in every situation I've ever applied it to, I was barely changing anything, or it was actively worse to have this thing equipped over anything else, including literally nothing. Yes, you are better off running literally nothing instead of using this thing. So what do? Honestly, I'm not sure I can give it the epic rarity level buff it deserves, but it at least needs to become not useless. The 30% proc chance is too low compared to other proc items you can use, and the attack speed nerf it gives is simply way too much for the minimal damage it provides. Change that 30% proc chance to at least a 40% proc chance. Reduce the 20% attack speed nerf to at least a 10% nerf. Hell, even 8% could technically work given the negation of the expertise trees and other trinkets. And finally, increase the weapon damage to a minimum of 200%. I want to note here that 200% very easily could be increased a bit further, but let's start small. The Enchanted Trident, Polearm's Legendary, applies a 200% weapon damage to literally any enemy that the lightning hits, while the Bloodforged Mass, the Molten Collapse Epic Rarity Hammer, provides a 300% weapon damage strike, then the Serrated Poker, the Molten Collapse Epic Rarity Polearm, does 200% weapon damage as a bleed. All this to say that there are much stronger and potent weapon damage procs that are guaranteed in large quantities, so this isn't too much, especially for an epic rarity. On a smaller, less important note, the slime-covered sheath is kind of just a less helpful Noble's necklace, but I guess the Nobles act as a direct upgrade later on, so maybe that's okay? I don't know if this needs any special rework or not, but I thought I'd note it here anyway, since it's a little bit of an odd balance. Last up for armor, I want to note that the Warrior's badge is underutilized, likely due to its low proc conditions, but probably because this thing literally doesn't even work right now. You can have way over 30 threat and the right weapon dealing a crit every hit, this thing still won't proc a single time. So who would have guessed it's not good? But it wasn't good even before it broke, so let's take a look at that. Axe in particular can use this trinket the most, with sword closely following with the right loadouts, but hammer just simply can't. Its low proc chance and minimal benefits make going for critical strike damage or critical strike chance a much better option than ever even looking at this thing, which is a shame. The thing is also uncapped, which I think will cause larger issues, notably for Axe, as Hatchet particularly could potentially proc this thing at an insane rate, though that could be limited by the Battle Axe classification if that was tacked on there instead of just Axe. As a result, I'm going to be evil and propose that this thing could have a stronger proc chance. 20% minimum to give slower speed loadouts like hammer and sword to be able to utilize this thing properly, but also implement a max capacity of 4, as 60% alone as a multiplier is a huge deal. That's double what the multiplier potion can offer you after all, so being uncapped is a dangerous game for what classes it's trying to cover. If the duration has to drop from 10 seconds for that to happen, so be it. Its 8 seconds of great power is still much better than 10 seconds of moderately sized donkey balls. Or of course, none of this can be changed since we haven't had any of this trinket functioning for a while now, making it very hard to test, but even before it broke, I never saw it widely utilized. So wow, that's the end of talking about armor, so let me take a few more minutes to talk about utility items before I end the video here, because weapon balancing would be way too much for this thing. So let's talk about explosives real quick. In my opinion, it often isn't worth it to bother carrying one of these things with you. The damage of both bombs and dynamite becomes widely less useful after the first 3 to 4 floors of their origin biome, with the only solid use for them being to access ancient loot rooms. These are nice event runes for early floors, don't get me wrong, especially for the Dwarven Caves, but afterward the loot tends to be negligible in the Crystal Caverns due to the natural weapon spawn placement within normal cave rooms, that combined with the other event rooms as a whole. This is a valid thing to carry all things considered, but compared to the potion options as floors go on, you're often much better carrying off a potion of your choice instead of just gambling on whether or not you can find a few extra chests on one floor. Literally, it's often just 2 chests. So 2 possibilities I recommend, as I don't want to downplay the ancient loot room. First off, the damage of both of these should be slightly increased. Right now, bombs and dynamite deal 20 and 35 damage respectively, which is often not a good majority of the enemy's health by the time you actually get your hands on one of these things. I suggest that one of the following is tweaked. Either the damage is flat increased by a small bit, just 5 for both, or 5 and 10 respectively, would help with reaching a slightly higher health threshold. This would help ensure it isn't too much while still having more incentive to keep one around. Alternatively, I think it would be interesting for explosives to deal a minimum of a high percentage of an enemy's health or a flat damage value, whichever one is higher. This makes explosives a much more valid crowd control method that can more efficiently help whittle down enemies to a finishing health value while making the explosives themselves more of a legitimate alternative to potions, yet still not as strong by a fair margin. No matter what the change is, whether the latter is done to both explosives or just the stronger to dynamite, I just want to see explosives a bit more helpful as a whole, not that they are awful as is. Oh, also, add the ancient loot room to the Molten Collapse as well, because wow, the amount of pots in that biome make finding 2 to 3 dynamites a floor a genuine probability, even at the reduced drop chance for clay pots. If the aforementioned scaling was added to the dynamite, that literal waste of a clay pot drop would actually have a use in the Molten Collapse. Or we could always just get a 3rd explosive type exclusive for the Molten Collapse for proper progression. Also ×2, add a task for killing enemies with explosives. As for the explosive that isn't an explosive, the Beanade, I want to add a general reminder that these things, under no circumstances, should be able to proc on hit or on damage effects from any weapon, and arguably any armor piece. It has been removed for certain weapons in the past, but throwing a Beanade down and getting literally a 3,500% critical strike damage is beyond an issue. It is widely unfair as a combo and has no place in the game. Throw it out. As a final change for this video, let's talk about the leather saddle real quick, which is an epic rarity utility item that lets you mount and control lava worms to fly around. I've openly voiced my complaints on this item for a while now, but I have a smaller compromise that I think the lords would be okay with. For better context, being able to shoot your own lava worm is an issue that was previously thought to be unintentional, and was often reported as a bug or a suggestion as a result. But later, Lord Spongy, co-developer, founder, and head coder for Heroic Pixel, stated that this was not an issue that would be fixed due to the problematic balance it could potentially bring. But as a reminder, which he also states here, this is an item that lasts a single floor and is often limited to only being useful to a single class, which is ranged. So here's what I asked of them. Keep the damage you can deal to lava worms as normal, but change the way the lava worm moves around to be more like a dwarf. As is, any slight movement in the non-straight direction makes the lava worm weirdly flick that direction for even the slightest movements, which makes any combat on this thing pretty annoying. Instead, make the movement function relative to the direction you're facing so that you can better maneuver on this thing. Moving diagonally keeps it looking straight while taking a flat forward. Moving sideways tilts the lava worm to angle in that direction, much like a bird does to move in the air, and backpedaling causes it to flap backward away from the direction you're facing. When you sit in an actual saddle, you not just randomly do a 180 and look at the tail of a horse. You are saddled in and holding on to what you're riding, especially when the thing you're holding onto is the equivalent of a flying 2004 Honda Pilot speeding through the air. It doesn't make much sense for the lava worm to be doing sick 360s while you're facing forward. All it does is make it easier to shoot a hole through the poor dude's wing. These changes ensure that it is still a great item that is just less frustrating and goofy to work with. It deserves to be powerful, yet possible to lose that power. After all, it's just a floor. Also, please make the lava worms passive upon putting a saddle on them or after the first mount, at the very least to the player who originally mounted them. Saddling one of these things and then watching it fly off into another room 3 floors above you, or watching it dome your poor little range user cross map with a fireball when dismounting it after it was friendly 3 seconds ago, is frankly just odd in my opinion. I think if the stupid lizard's going to be friendly when you're on its back, which is usually when something is going to be at its angriest, then suddenly trying to murder you the second you hop down, there's just not a lot of sense in it. I want to pacify my silly lava worm friend. And that's it. I appreciate all you crawlers for listening to an old man ramble. I hope that some of these rebalances find their way into consideration, as my immense yapping for each point has to amount to something. If this is interesting enough of a video to the crawling masses, I may look into doing another one of these for all weapons as well, but this turned out so much larger than I initially anticipated, so I had to split the two apart. I do other sprite work and abhorrent amount of Vino fights in this channel, so go check those out if that's something you're interested in. That being said, crawl on, crawlers.